All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. So, after being extremely quiet for the bulk of this free agency period, the New York Mets have been very active in the past week or so. After missing out on outfielder Kyle Tucker, who decided to join the Los Angeles Dodgers, the Mets soon turned their attention to former Toronto Blue Jays infielder Bo Bichette, as both sides agreed on a 3-year deal for 126 million, acquiring outfielder Luis Robert from the Chicago White Sox earlier this week. And of course, the biggest move so far this offseason by the Mets was their acquisition of all-star starting pitcher Freddy Peralta from the Milwaukee Brewers yesterday. Now, with all of these moves, coupled with the quiet moves rather, that were made earlier in this offseason for the Mets, has their president of baseball operations, David Stearns, done enough to change the narrative about his team with the start of spring training just about a month away? Remember, David Stearns, even though he's a native New Yorker, was not a guy or has not been a guy who has been who put he hasn't been put in a fond light, if you will, by a lot of the Mets fans. Remember, Stearns was recently spotted at a Knicks game at Madison Square Garden, and he was booed heavily by the fan base there. And I could understand it because this offseason saw the Mets bid farewell to some fan favorites such as Pete Alonso, Brandon Nimmo, and Jeff McNeil. And then, of course, the surprise departure of all-star closing pitcher Edwin Diaz, who decided to join the Los Angeles Dodgers. So now we've got some new look Mets, okay? And you look at some of these new additions to this team. Bo Bichette, who's more than likely going to play third base. You've got Marcus Simeon, who's more than likely going to play second base after the Mets picked him up for the Trek Texas Rangers, and they sent Brandon Nimmo there. Luis Robert from the White Sox, definitely going to be in the outfield. And then you've got Jorge Polanco, a guy who's basically been an infielder and a DH throughout his career. And there's talks about Polanco possibly playing first base for the first time in his career with the Mets. But you look at these moves that the Mets have been making so far, and you ask yourself, have they gotten themselves enough protection for Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor in the lineup? Because that was a huge thing that we're talking about here. Once Pete Alonso departed from this team, were the Mets going to have anybody that was going to protect Juan Soto in that lineup? That was a big time question coming in. You think about it, and you think about the productivity that Soto and Alonso had together last year. We saw Soto hit 43 home runs for the Mets. He drove in 105. Pete Alonso hit 38 home runs for the Mets and drove in 126, hitting right there behind Juan Soto. So now you've got Marcus Simeon in this lineup, and this is a guy. He wasn't healthy last year with Texas. He batted 230, 15 home runs, 62 runs batted in. But this is a guy who has the potential, when everything is right, to be a guy who's going to hit 35 home runs and drive in 100 runs. That's going to be important. Bo Bichette, basically, he's a career 294 hitter. He was not healthy last year either for the Jays. But if he's healthy, we're talking about a guy who can flirt with hitting 300, hit about 20 home runs, drive in about 90 runs. You've got Jorge Polanco, a guy who had one of his best seasons last year with Seattle, helping them to reach the American League Championship Series. And then you've got Luis Robert. Luis Robert's best season in the majors so far came in 2023 for the White Sox when he hit 264, 38 home runs, and 80 runs batted in. That's the Luis Robert that the Mets are going to need in this lineup for it to work. Also, a big issue offensively with the Mets last year. It wasn't the fact that they couldn't score runs. It was all about hitting with guys on base. That was the biggest bugaboo for the Mets. Also, the Mets had an issue where they might have one game where they score 15 runs where everybody's hitting, and then the next game they hit maybe get one or two runs and probably have like three or four hits. So they need more consistency from their lineup. Those are going to be some key things right there. Of course, um, like David Stearns talked about run prevention. Is this going to be a better defensive team for the Mets? We have to wait and see. But pitching wise, the acquisition of Freddy Peralta definitely changes things for New York because he gives them something that they've been lacking, a frontline starter. The Mets have tried, okay, but they do not have themselves a frontline starter. We saw Peralta go 17-6 last year in 33 starts with the Brewers with a 2.70 ERA. The biggest thing for me with Peralta is that each of the last 3 years, he struck out more than 200 batters. He's gotten close to, if not surpassed, 175 innings pitched. And that's important as well because why? When you think about the whole run prevention aspect from Stearns' standpoint, okay, the Mets were one of the worst teams last year in baseball, all of baseball, as far as their quality starts. Only the Colorado Rockies and Miami Marlins had fewer quality starts than the Mets had last season. They're going to need their starters to go further in games consistently. Too often, a Met starter got to 5 innings if they were lucky, and that was it, and it got turned over to the bullpen. They're going to need a guy like Peralta to consistently give them 6 or 7 innings. Brandon Sproat was a part of that trade with the Brewers to get Peralta back, but you also have another youngster that you're high on in Nolan McLean. David Peterson, can he be consistent for the Mets in the rotation in 2026? I think the Mets, they had to like what they saw first time around from Clay Holmes as a starter. Remember, Clay Holmes was a bullpen guy all throughout his career up until last year when the Mets signed him away from the Yankees. Maybe he can build off of that. Kodai Senga, you never know what you're going to get because he cannot stay healthy. And I'm sure that the Mets are hoping that they have a bounce back season from Sean Manaea. And you still got Jonathan, who really did not need to be in the majors last year. He was rushing into action. I don't see him starting the season with the Mets. Definitely in the minors to keep on refining his stuff, and he will definitely be called upon at some point during the year. And of course, the question is going to be, will the Mets have themselves enough starting pitching? Because starting pitching was something that did them in last year. Also, a throw in for this Peralta deal, which I think is a player that a lot of people are glossing over, is a Tobias Myers. He could be a long reliever out of the pen. He could also pick up some starts. That's going to be important because I feel like if he's on point, this could be a move that flies under the radar for the Metropolitans. So if you're David Stearns and of course Mets team owner Steve Cohen, I think the narrative of your team has changed because you know the off season in baseball is just like the regular season is in baseball. It's not a marathon; it's a sprint. And of course, when free agency begins, everybody wants to see who are the big ticket guys that their respective team is going to sign. You'll always expect the big deals to go down at the winter meetings. And of course, the big deals that went down at the winter meetings involve now former Mets players. We saw Pete Alonso sign with Baltimore. We saw Edwin Diaz go to the Dodgers. And of course, the Met fan base is like, well, what is this team doing? Well, guess what? In recent years, we've seen more and more teams really stretch this thing out, trying to find their guys. And this is what David Stearns and the Mets have done. And of course, pitchers and catchers are going to report in less than a month, probably 3 weeks, maybe 2 weeks, give or take. But nonetheless, they're starting to piece this thing together. And just like they're piecing this thing together right now, it's going to take time, I truly think, for this team to gel as the 2026 season goes along because there's so many new parts to this team. But I think the Mets are hopeful that the new players will mesh with the older players on this team, kind of like a Francisco Lindor and a Juan Soto, to have themselves a very productive season. So I'm looking at it like this with the Mets. I think with these moves that they've done so far this week, I think, in my opinion, it's changed the narrative for them in the National League East as far as being able to contend. You still got to worry about the Braves. You still got to worry about the Philadelphia Phillies. It's going to be interesting to see how much improved that both the Nationals and the Marlins are, but especially with the way that last season ended for the Mets. I think it left a very bad taste in their mouths. David Stearns and Steve Cohen wanted to retool this team, and this is what we are seeing so far this offseason. But like I said, the Freddy Peralta deal to me showed that the Mets are open for business and the Mets are not going to take it lying down. I am not here to sit up and say, well, the Mets are going to turn around and win 100 games for the upcoming season. Absolutely not. But I think there are some pieces on this team that look better right now than this team did at the end of last season, of course, when they lost to the Marlins on the final game of the season. I like this lineup now with a Marcus Simeon, with a Bo Bichette in there, sprinkled in with the likes of Francisco Lindor, sprinkled in with the likes of Juan Soto. I think the Mets are hopeful that a young Brett Beatty will continue to improve. I think the Mets are also hopeful that Mark Vientos will have a bounce back season. Remember, he was a big part of this club in 2024 when they got to the postseason. Vientos was never really healthy last season, and his bat was never right at the plate either. So I think I expect, or I anticipate rather, that the Mets are hopeful that he gets back on track. I'm sure they're probably hopeful that Francisco Alvarez can stay healthy behind the plate. So there's a lot of interesting things for this Met squad. But nonetheless, like I said before, the acquisition of Freddy Peralta, along with the signing of Bo Bichette, I really do feel is helping to change the narrative for this team heading into spring training. David Stearns, love him or hate him, but you know what? He can be a mad scientist at times, and he's trying to piece this thing together. And maybe the people who booed him in the off season, maybe the narrative will change on him as the season goes. We've got to wait and see. But nonetheless, this Met squad within the last 72 to 96 hours looks a lot different than it did a week before. And if you're a Met fan, this is something that's got to intrigue you. I truly do believe. But nonetheless, the Mets now have themselves a frontline starter in Peralta. This lineup looks a lot different with the addition of Bo Bichette. Let's see if the Mets are done this offseason, and let's see if they could turn it into a positive season, get back to the playoffs, and possibly make a run in October. But nonetheless, fine folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank each and every one of you for checking out the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. And as always, if you like what you heard and saw on this podcast, you know what to do. Just hit that like button as well as subscribing to the channel. And like I always say, it's greatly appreciated. Also, if you're on the X, formerly known as Twitter, you can check me out anytime at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you give me that follow, it will be my pleasure to do the same in return. And that also goes for Instagram, where you can check me out at 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge. Also, if you're on Facebook, definitely check out the Sports Depot 365. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the better sports groups going on social media. And also, definitely be sure to check out this channel tomorrow, as I will be talking everything about the upcoming AFC and NFC championship games this Sunday. But until next time, fine folks, my name is William Martin. I'm signing off, and I'm saying thanks once again for checking out the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. Be well, everybody.